Hello, and welcome back to Entering the Infinite, the Magic the Gathering podcast, all about infinite combos. I am your host, Aaron Bennick. Wow, it's been a long time. I originally took off the week of Thanksgiving, and then December rolled around, and I just figured it would probably just be for my own best interest to just take off all of December, what with the holidays and everything. But I am back. I have a lot of new episodes of Entering the Infinite planned in 2022. I have a lot of great things coming as well. One very big thing that people have actually been requesting of a lot lately is deck lists. And from this episode on, and including episodes before this one, each episode is going to have a deck list, apart from things like set reviews or just general topics that I'm talking about. So, without further ado, let's get into this week's episode, which is Toggo and Kodama. So, I'm going to read Toggo first here. Toggo, Goblin Weaponsmith, is 2 and a red for a legendary creature, a Goblin Artificer. He's a 2/2. And Toggo says, whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, create a colorless equipment artifact token named Rock. And the Rock has, equipped creature has 1, tap the creature, sacrifice Rock, the creature deals 2 damage to any target, and equip 1, and Toggo has partner, and he is partnered up with Kodama of the East Tree, which is 4 green and a green for a legendary creature spirit. Kodama is a 6/6 and has reach, and says, whenever another permanent enters the battlefield under your control, if it wasn't put onto the battlefield with this ability, you may put a permanent card with equal or lesser converted mana cost from your hand onto the battlefield. Now, the important text on Kodama is that equal to or lesser than. That's the main reason why Kodama can even go infinite. So the combo for this deck, and you might have already heard about this, is you just need Kodama, Toggo, and a bounce land, so Gruul Turf. So the way that the combo works is when you play Gruul Turf, you have 3 different triggers. You have Kodama's trigger, you have Toggo's trigger, and you have the Gruul Turf return a land to your hand trigger because it's a bounce land. So the first thing that you do is you return the land back to your hand. So then Toggo makes a rock, and then Kodama sees the rock come into play and says you can put something from your hand onto the board. So you put Gruul Turf into play. Well, when you put Gruul Turf into play, you immediately return Gruul Turf back to your hand because it's a bounce land, and Toggo makes another rock, which then lets you put the bounce land back into play, etc., etc. So when you have that loop, you make infinite rock artifact tokens. So one of the reasons that this combo is really, really good is because 2 of your 3 pieces are already in the command zone. You always have access to Toggo, you always have access to Kodama, you always have the ability to just go infinite by just playing your commanders and playing your bounce land. And the bounce land is really easily found since you're in green, and green loves and has so many different ways to find lands, put lands in your hand or put lands into play. And from there, the deck really just needs some kind of payoff in order to actually close out the game. So you can make infinite rock tokens and you can have an infinite landfall, but without some sort of other process, you don't have a great way. You don't have the ability to actually close out the game. You do infinite of 2 things, but they don't actually cause you to win the game right then and there. So, one of the great ways that you can win the game is almost any kind of artifact payoff, really. So since Toggo makes artifact tokens, it really makes sense to include not too many cards, but quite a few cards that care about artifacts. Since you have access to Toggo all the time, so you're going to be making rock tokens no matter what. And there really isn't any synergy with artifacts other than Toggo. But since he is in the command zone, you'll always have access to the ability. So I don't feel too bad about dedicating some spots to a little bit of artifact synergy, since you're always going to be able to have some of that synergy because Toggo is always in your command zone. So one of the first artifact cards, and I think that this one is actually really, really good in this deck for multiple reasons. It is the Quicksmith Genius. So Quicksmith Genius is 2 and a red for a creature human artificer. It's a 3/2. And it says, whenever an artifact enters the battlefield under your control, you may discard a card. If you do, draw a card. So I like this a lot because, first of all, it's a pretty decent card draw engine. It might seem pretty bad that it says discard a card, then draw a card. But it's basically a red Riddlemaster. And if you don't know what Riddlemaster does, it's a blue creature that says whenever you, I think, cast an artifact, you loot. You draw a card and then discard a card. So you do go the other way around. You do have to discard and then draw, but it really isn't that big of a downside. With the Quicksmith Genius in play and with the combo active, you can also draw your entire deck. So it's just really good value early on. You play this, then you play Toggo, you play a land, you draw a card, make a rock token, equip it to the Genius, and all kinds of cool shenanigans. Worth noting though, you don't actually go up on any cards if you're using this in a kind of combo sense. You always keep the same number of cards in your hand since you're discarding and drawing. But if you have this out and you have some open mana and you already have your combo active, it hardly matters, since at that point you're essentially tutoring just for a card. So you have your combo active, you have like 2 mana open, you have a forest and a mountain up, you have your combo active, you have Quicksmith Genius out, you are just looking through your deck to find, let's say, Reckless Fireweaver, which is actually the next card that I wanted to talk about. Reckless Fireweaver is 1 and a red for a creature, human artificer. It is a 1/3, and whenever an artifact enters the battlefield under your control, Reckless Fireweaver, deals 1 damage to each opponent. So, a lot like the Quicksmith Genius, it is super great value, but it's also very good in the infinite combo. It's just a compact win condition and a great payoff. Pinging all your opponents for for every artifact that comes into play, or your rock tokens that you're getting, is basically exactly what you want to be doing. It just provides you that additional value. And over the course of the game, if you play the Reckless Fireweaver early, it can result in 5-10 life lost, even maybe. Just paying 2 mana to, over the course of the game, take out a quarter of each of your opponent's life total is pretty good value. The next card is very similar to Fireweaver. It is the Quicksilver Aether Grid, which is 2 and a red for an enchantment. Quicksilver Aether Grid says tap 2 untapped artifacts you control. Quicksilver Aether Grid deals 1 damage to target creature or player. So it's similar to Fireweaver, but it's also very different since you actually have the ability to target creatures with it. So if you have enough rock tokens, which you might be able to, maybe later in the game if you haven't sacrificed any of them, you got a couple lying around, someone's commander is like a 1/1 or a 1/2, something like that. You have the ability to kind of ping it off of the board. So I like Quicksilver Aether Grid a lot because under the right circumstances, it can double as single target removal, and it's also a really good infinite payoff, and it just kind of gets you that value even if you don't go infinite at all. And having a card that provides that much value over like 3 different areas that we really want is just really, really good. It's also worth noting that when you sacrifice a rock, you don't actually tap the rock itself. You tap the creature and sacrifice the rock. So what you can do is you can actually tap rocks to the gear per Aether grid, and then also tap the creature and sacrifice the rock in order to deal additional damage. So I also think that that's kind of some cool synergy right there. The next cards, and both of these are kind of in the same boat. One is a little better under combo lines. One is a little better just as kind of a value piece. It is Inspiring Statuary and Quirk Clan Ironworks. So I'm going to read the Statuary first. So Statuary is 3 mana for an artifact, and it says non-artifact spells you cast have Improvise. So if you don't know what Improvise does, Improvise reads, your artifacts can help cast spells with Improvise. Each artifact you tap after you're done activating mana abilities pays for 1. So essentially, Inspiring Statuary says that all of your artifacts basically are mana rocks for anything that isn't an artifact. And then Quirk Clan Ironworks is 4 mana for an artifact. Sacrifice an artifact, add 2 to your mana pool. So Quirk Clan Ironworks is definitely a lot better in the combo aspect and the combo lines of the deck, because when you have infinite rocks, then you have infinite colorless mana with Quirk Clan Ironworks. But with the Inspiring Statuary, you don't necessarily have infinite mana. You just don't pay colorless costs on your spells with Inspiring Statuary and enough rocks. So I think they're both really good. Inspiring Statuary is more like just like a value card, a way to kind of ramp a little bit better. Quirk Clan Ironworks is also kind of a way to ramp, but it's very well known for being like a notorious combo card, so it's more likely to get blown off the board than the Inspiring Statuary is, which is why I think that KCI is better as just like a combo card instead of like a value thing, and Inspiring Statuary is the opposite. But I think that both of them have really good value by just letting you use your rock tokens as mana rocks instead of damage dealing rocks. And then one of the last cards for artifact payoffs is Trading Post, which is 4 mana for an artifact, and it has 4 different abilities. So you pay 1, tap it, discard a card, you can gain 4 life. You can pay 1, tap it, pay 1 life, create a 0/1 white goat creature token. 1 and tap it, sacrifice a creature, return target artifact card from your graveyard to your hand. 1 and tap it, sacrifice an artifact, draw a card. So, one of the things that's just fun about Trading Post is that each of its abilities actually helps you do the next ability. So, by discarding a card and gaining 4 life, you then have life to pay to make a goat token. And then by having a creature, you can then sacrifice it to get an artifact card from your graveyard to your hand. And then by sacrificing that artifact that you then replay, you draw a card, which you can then discard to gain 4 life. Trading Post is just like a really fun card, but it's in the deck because of that last ability, which is just 1 tap, sacrifice an artifact, draw a card. So Inspiring Statuary and KCI lets us cash in our rocks for mana. Trading Post lets us cash in our rocks for additional cards in the hand. If we're not sacrificing our rocks for damage, or we don't need the additional mana, instead you can sacrifice them for some extra cards, and it's just a really solid draw engine. I really like a play of, you already have Quicksilver Genius, so you play your land, you discard a card, draw a card, and then you use Trading Post to sacrifice the rock that you just made to draw an additional card. Maybe you dealt a damage or something with a Reckless Fireweaver. There's just a lot of synergy there to be had. So the next part of the deck is because the infinite combo actually needs a land card to complete it, it makes more sense to be a land-based. It makes more sense to have a little bit more land synergy than it does artifact synergy, because there's definitely a time where Toggo could become a little bit too expensive to cast. So we just want all kinds of other payoffs. So one of the cards that I actually really, really like in this deck, especially in the land payoff part, is Tireless Provisioner. So Tireless Provisioner is 2 and a green for a creature and elf scout. It is a 3/2, and it has landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, create a food token or a treasure token. I love this card in this deck so much because it provides us additional artifact synergy outside of Toggo, and it makes super relevant tokens. Food tokens, a little bit of additional life, that's definitely relevant. But they're also just random artifacts that we can be sacrificing to KCI or Trading Post. And they're random artifacts that we can be tapping to our Gear per Aether Grid and all that kind of stuff. And treasures are just always good. Additional mana is always good. So I really, really like Tireless Provisioner because it actually basically does the same thing as Toggo, which is whenever lands enter, it gives us an artifact token that we can abuse in more ways than one. The next card under land payoffs, it's kind of not a land payoff, sort of, but it kind of is. It is Ashaya, Soul of the Wild. Ashaya is 3 green and green for a legendary creature elemental. Ashaya, Soul of the Wild's power and toughness are each equal to the number of lands you control, and non-token creatures you control are forest lands in addition to their other types. So, Toggo's rocks need creatures to equip them to. Toggo's rocks are equipment. The deck has plenty of creatures in it. The deck is running 28 creatures, and then some if you count some of the other stuff that I'll talk about later. But the deck has so many creatures in it. Ashaya is a really good enabler because Ashaya turns all of those creatures into lands, which just means more rock tokens. So the reason that I think Ashaya is like a land payoff is because it's essentially turning 28 more cards in your deck into lands, which means that you're going to have that many more rock tokens to sacrifice to Trading Post or entering the battlefield to deal damage with Reckless Fireweaver and all that kind of stuff. Another really good land payoff is Morog, Fury of Akum. And Morog is 4, a red and a red, for a legendary creature, a Minotaur Warrior. Morog is a 6/6. Morog says, each creature you control gets +1/+0 for each time it is attacked this turn. And he has landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, if it's your main phase, there's an additional combat phase after this phase, and at the beginning of that combat, untap all creatures you control. Again, with all the creatures we have, and we do have a lot of token makers, creature token makers. I'll talk about that in a little later. But with all of those creatures that we have on board, all of those creatures that have rock tokens on them, even just having maybe 2 extra combats with some decent pump from Morog could be enough to just end the game entirely without going infinite at all. If you just have a bunch of tokens, you've dealt some damage with your Reckless Fireweaver, Hour of Promise into 2 lands, and then Morog has you take 3 combats essentially, and then all your creatures are getting +1/+0, and then +2/+0, and then +3/+0. That is a lot of damage, and you could very easily just close out the game. It is also worth noting that Morog says at the beginning of that combat, untap all creatures you control. So what you can actually do is all of those creatures that you tap to sacrifice rocks, you can do it again. If you somehow made more rocks in between, you main phase, went to combat, did a bunch of stuff, somehow got some extra lands, go to combat again with Morog, you have more rocks, they all tap again for more rock damage. I just thought that was kind of interesting little bit of synergy with Morog and the rocks. And then the last part of the land payoffs is 3 creatures that basically do the same thing. You've got Cozy's Ravager, Spitfire Lagak, and Tunneling Geopede. They all have different mana costs, they all have different power and toughness, creature types, but they essentially all do the same thing, which is they deal damage to our opponents whenever lands come into play. The Spitfire Lagak and the Tunneling Geopede deal damage to each opponent. Cozy's Ravager only deals damage to a single opponent. But if we're going infinite, I'm not really sure that it matters that much, just because you're still going to deal infinite damage to all your opponents. They all read the same. Lands deal damage to the opponents. It's just more cards that give you more value as the game progresses, and they're just really good payoffs for when you actually go infinite. Okay, so one of the other major parts about this deck that I made sure to like really include was token makers. Part of Kodama's combo is that he needs something that makes tokens whenever your land enters the battlefield. That way you can actually put the land back into play. If you don't have Toggo, you still need something to do. You still need something that makes a token so that you can still go infinite. Most of the token makers in the deck make creatures, which is part of exactly what we want, because you want a lot of creatures so that you have a lot of creatures to equip rocks to. And they are just tokens so that when you actually go infinite, if you don't have access to Toggo, you still have tokens that you can go infinite with. It's also worth saying that if you make an infinite board state, an infinitely big board state, and none of your opponents have a board wipe, and it just passes to your turn, you just win. It's much more preferable to win on your own turn, which is why like Reckless Fireweaver, Spitfire Lagak are in the deck, but backup win conditions, you gotta have them. So most of the token makers just make creatures whenever lands come into play. Omnath, Locus of Rage, Rampaging Baloths, Scoot Swarm. These are all just creatures, land comes in, make a token. One that I kind of wanted to talk about for a little bit, though, was Dragon Master Outcast. So it's a single red for a 1/1. It's a creature or human shaman. At the beginning of your upkeep, if you control 6 or more lands, create a 5/5 red dragon creature token with flying. So it doesn't say landfall, put a token into play, but it does make tokens and it does care about lands. So I did think that it was kind of a decent include to the deck. You can play it out early, you can get aggressive with it. It's just kind of another way to help give you some additional value for having as many lands as you do. So I just thought that it was kind of a cool include. So the next thing that I wanted to talk about was the fact that Toggo makes not only artifact tokens, we've already gone over some of that, but they're also equipment. So I wanted to put a little bit of not too much, but I wanted to put a little bit of equipment synergy in the deck. So the first one is Valduk, Keeper of the Flame. Valduk is 2 and a red for a legendary creature, a human shaman. Valduk is a 3/2 and reads, at the beginning of combat on your turn, for each aura and equipment attached to Valduk, Keeper of the Flame, create a 3/1 elemental creature token with trample and haste. Exile those tokens at the beginning of the next end step. If you have 5-6 rocks and you just put all of them onto Valduk, that is 5 or 6 3/1s with trample and haste you are making on each of your combat steps that you can just throw away at your opponents. That is some really good synergy, especially because they're tokens. They do go away though, so they're not like actual tokens, but Valduk I think is really good value because you can just move all your rocks over to him, and you could just repeatedly smash face to him, kind of let Valduk be a threat, kind of let your opponents look at him and look away from the rest of your board while you try to assemble the rest of your combo. And the next piece of equipment synergy is Kazul's Toll Collector. Kazul's Toll Collector is 2 and a red for a creature Ogre Warrior. It's a 3/2, and it has pays 0. Attach target equipment you control to Kazul's Toll Collector. Activate this ability only anytime you can cast a sorcery. So, not nearly as much value as Valduk, but you can just move all of your rocks over to Kazul's Toll Collector and let him repeatedly throw rocks at all of your opponents' planeswalkers or creatures or their faces. And it's just kind of like a repeatable cannon, basically, because you can just move all the rocks over to him and just let him sit there with all the rocks and just throw them wherever you want. But it's also fun because if you don't want to attack with Kazul's Toll Collector and you have Morog, like I said earlier, Morog lets you untap all your creatures. So with Kazul's Toll Collector, it would be you just get to untap him and throw a rock, untap him again, throw a rock, combat, all that kind of stuff. The Valduk also has really good synergy with Morog, because it says at the beginning of combat on your turn, Morog doesn't care about, or Valduk doesn't care about which combat, and Morog gives you additional combats. So it's just a lot of fun. It's, some cool synergy there with those two. Morog also makes the elemental tokens much bigger too. He actually turns them into 4/1s, and then he turns them into 5/1s if you take an additional combat phase. So there's just all kinds of little synergy in between a lot of the cards in this deck. And then the last one that I wanted to put in for equipment is the Reckless Crew. Reckless Crew is 3 and a red for a sorcery, and it says create X 2/1 red dwarf berserker creature tokens, where X is the number of vehicles you control plus the number of equipment you can control. For each of those tokens, you may attach an equipment you control to it. So you cast this for 4 mana. You have 6 rocks on the board. You make 6 2/1 red dwarf berserker creature tokens, and then you attach each of those 6 rocks to each of those Reckless Crews, and then you have a bunch of tokens. You have a bunch of creatures that have rock tokens on them that you can then tap them to throw willy-nilly into the ether. So this deck has a lot of little things about it that kind of cross over, right? And that's one of the reasons why I actually really like this partner pair, is because you can do so much with just the two of them, and then a bunch of just the little things that they both kind of want you to do. You want lands, you want equipment synergy, you want artifact synergy, you want all that kind of stuff. And I think that it turns out to be a really cool deck. So the next thing that I want to talk about is I just want to talk about tutors just for a little bit. So you already have Kodama, you already have Toggo. I specifically left out things like Gamble or Worldly Tutor, Shared Summons, any kind of creature tutor really, because I didn't think that it was necessary, because you have so many payoffs for any of the things that you want to do. Spitfire, Lagak, Reckless Fire, and anything really. I didn't think it was necessary to try to have tutors specifically for finding those kinds of things, because there's just so much of it. You're bound to have a payoff or two, maybe even in your opening hand by the time you combo. So I thought that it was much more important to put in land tutors instead in order to actually find your Gruul Turf or your Guildless Commons, which is a bounce land that only taps for 2 colorless. But I thought it was a little bit important to have more than one bounce land. That way, if something happens, it gets strep mined, you're not completely out of the woods. So for land tutors, each of these cards just finds a land and either puts it in a play or puts it in your hand. You've got Expedition Map, Crop Rotation, Sylvan Scrying, Reap and Sow, Pier's Whim, Nylea's Intervention, and Hour of Promise. So that is quite a few land tutors. That's 7 land tutors. So you're pretty good on being able to find your combo pieces there. And then there aren't a lot of utility lands. There aren't a lot of like other utility lands that I really wanted, but you might want something else. Worth noting, Field of the Dead actually makes a token whenever a land comes into play. If you control 7 or more lands that have different names. But if you don't have access to Toggo, you can Field of the Dead. You can go off with Field of the Dead because it makes tokens whenever land comes into play, and it's also tutorable. So I just thought that was a little bit of something to take note of. But the rest of the deck is mostly just removal, things like Reclamation Sage, Blasphemous Act, some other kind of interaction, Heroic Intervention. I put a Tybalt's Trickery in the deck. I thought that would be it's just a decent counterspell. The rest of the deck is just, ramp, card draw, removal, the backbone of everything. And I did want to take some time at the end of this to kind of talk about Kodama specifically. So this deck is pretty streamlined for Toggo and Kodama, right? Like, this is probably, it's not the most optimal that you could run it, but the way that you want to perform the combo, this is the most optimal. And what I mean is not necessarily the build, but having Kodama and Toggo in the command zone. That's the most optimal way to perform the Kodama bounce land loop, so that you have 2 out of the 3 cards that you need in the command zone and not just 1. So it's going to be way faster because you already have access to 2 of your pieces in the command zone, which is all I mean when I say optimized. It's just probably the fastest version of the Kodama bounce land loops, because you have access to 2 out of your 3 of your cards essentially in your opening hand. What you can do, though, is you can kind of play around with a lot of different partners. So Kodama has partner, and you 100% need Kodama. He is crucial for the bounce land loop. But you don't necessarily need Toggo. He's just probably the best option. But I definitely think that it would be interesting to play around with different partners and maybe go for a more landfall-based combo deck. So, for instance, by adding black. First of all, by adding black, you get access to the best tutors in the entire game. But you also get access to some additional cards that let you hit your opponents with damage whenever lands come into play. Cards like, there's an Omnixilis that says landfall, an opponent takes, I think, 3 damage whenever land comes into play. There is Retreat to Hagra, I believe, that says each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life for landfall. And there's also Dread Presence, which specifically cares about swamps, but with something like Urborg or Dryad of the Listening Grove, that's not a problem. And Dread Presence says whenever Swamp comes into play, you can either draw a card and lose a life, or you can deal damage to an opponent and you gain some life. So I think adding black could be really cool. By adding white, you get a bunch more token makers. You get a bunch more creatures, or a bunch more cards that care about making creature tokens. So you could lean a bit more heavily into the landfall token aspect of the deck. And by adding blue, you just get access to some better card draw, kind of streamline the deck a little bit more. I'm not sure that blue has too much to offer in the way of direct landfall combos, except maybe bounce land combos with like Retreat to Coral Helm and stuff like that. But I think that partners are definitely something to look into with playing Kodama of the East Tree. And different partners in different colors will have different effects on the deck. By adding black, you're going to deal a bunch more damage with alongside of your red cards. By adding blue, you're going to add more reliant card draw. By adding white, you're going to put more creatures on your board. So if Toggo and the cute little synergies with the artifacts is not necessarily the way that you want to go, Kodama does have partner, so you can change up Toggo with whoever you want, Vile Smasher, Ludovic. But overall, I think that Kodama is a really interesting addition to the world of combo, just because we don't get too many landfall combos, and it's especially a little bit rarer, I would say, to kind of see that in a commander, especially one that has partner, which I think makes Kodama especially dangerous, but also infinitely cool. So that is Toggo and Kodama for this week. I apologize for a little bit of a shorter episode, but hopefully next week I will get back to around the 45 minutes, hour mark. If you would like to see the full deck list that I built for this, you can find it in the comments, along with most of the other deck lists from past episodes in my profile on Moxfield. That's where all these deck lists are going, and they're all going to be in the description of every episode. So, as always, tell me what you guys think of Kodama. Are you going to do Toggo and Kodama? Do you already have Toggo and Kodama? Is there anything in your build that I left out that you think should 100% go in? Are you going to build Kodama with someone that's not Toggo? And if so, who? I would love to hear any kind of feedback that you guys have. And as always, thanks for listening, and tune in next time when we enter the infinite.